Let me take this opportunity to welcome you to, this is our third program of the semester. And then we're going to continue this in the fall. And we know of at least one seminar should be on the scarcity of water resources in the third world. We have that in the first world too. I want to thank Brian Smith and Dr. Smith and Dr. Hall and Dr. Parkinson for their willingness to participate in this seminar this evening. I also want to thank Bob Slanker for taping these programs as he does every time. They're on channel 16. If you want to watch it, spread the word in the community. And people tell me all the time they see us on television. So that's good. We can get out in the community. People aren't here. And I want to welcome everybody. Dr. Klein is here, Chair of the Department of History and Political Science, a good colleague, member of the Association of Third World Study, past president, so forth. We have these meetings, as you know, to inform people about the third world. Hopefully it'll lead to something good. Maybe we can prevent a war or a future war, or maybe we can establish a business or better economic relations. Maybe we can just respect somebody more by knowing, about their history and culture. So it does have value, and we need more of it. We're not doing this for the first time. We're going in our 30th year next year. And I think I've said this many times. It all started in this room. Also, my wife is over here. I want to recognize her. Better do that. Tonight's U.S. policy toward Pakistan and Afghanistan. I think the health care issue has sort of taken this away. But Secretary Clinton met in Washington today in a strategic dialogue on Pakistan, and mentioned something about they want a nuclear, civilian nuclear arms deal, and that'll be interesting to see how that comes out. Our first speaker on this is Dr. Richard Hall, and Dr. Hall has been here 9 years, approximately 9 years, I believe. And is that right, or 8?
8.
8, okay.
Seems like more.
Yeah, it seems like. But I remember when he came. And we were glad that he signed on Georgia Southwestern. He's a great teacher and also a great scholar. He has a great background, Vanderbilt, Ohio State University, teaching all over the country, including the Ohio State University and Mankato State up in cold Minnesota. And then finally, he came over here to be with us. He teaches just about everything, concentration European history. And he has 4 books, 2 of which were published in the last 2 years, 2009 and 2010. Consumed by War, European Conflict in the 20th Century, 2009, University of Kentucky Press, and Balkan Breakthrough, the Battle of Pavropol, 1918, Indiana University Press. I don't know how many people can write 2 books teaching a full load in 2 years. I have not seen that. I congratulate you on that, Richard. That is really fantastic. And he's also authored a number of articles and book reviews. Has taught abroad in Bulgaria in our program over there, and also his most recent honor is the Featured Scholar Award for 2009-2010. I think you're the second recipient of that. What Gary Fisk was the first. And I'm glad that people are recognized here, you know, for scholarly attainments. I think, especially we need something to keep the morale up, especially the way things are in other areas, you know, the economic areas. So Richard is going to give us some overview and background of U.S. policy toward Pakistan and Afghanistan. So please join me in welcoming once more Dr. Richard Hall.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs. Well, the background to U.S. policy to Afghanistan and Pakistan, there wasn't any. Thank you. But I'll give you some background to Pakistan and Afghanistan. These 2 locations right together are in an area of extreme geographic complexity. Complex in terms of terrain and complex in terms of the human geography there. In terrain, there are 3 big features that come together in this Pakistan, Afghanistan area. Let me see. It's got a map here. But you can't tell all the geographic features. The first feature is the Indus River, a large, slow-flowing river coming out of the western Himalayas. The second feature is the western extension of the Himalayas in this region called the Hindu Kush, high mountains. And the third feature is the Iranian upland, or Iranian highlands. Now, ethnically, this is also 3 main features come together here. To the west, Iran, Persia, the Persian culture, the Persian language. To the east, India. Again, the Indian language, the Indian culture. And to the north, mainly Turkish culture. Central Asia. Where at this juncture of these 3 geographic features and these 3 ethnic features is a region of extreme human complexity. There are a variety of distinct ethnic groups, Punjabis, Pashtos, Balukis, Uzbeks, and many others. All of these are most of these, I should say, are from the Indo-European or from the Turkish group of languages. The only factor that binds these groups of people together is Islam. Almost everybody in this region is a follower of Islam, but Islam in itself is not necessarily binding. In Pakistan and in Afghanistan, about 80% of the populations are followers of the majority faction in Islam, the Sunni faction, and about 20% are Shia, or the minority faction. And as we know from Iraq, the rift between these 2 factions can be quite large. Now, the region itself, in terms of these 2 states, is fairly new, but civilization there is old. The Indus Valley is one of the four original riverine sources of human civilization, along with the Nile, Mesopotamia, and the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers in China. In all four of these locations, civilization started at about the same time, about 3,000 before the Common Era, or 3000 BC, if you like. The Harappan civilization was the original one in the Indus Valley. It's the least well known of these four because the climate in this region was not conducive to the preservation of artifacts or bodies or architectural remains. Nonetheless, this was a source of the original civilization in India, and during the first 3,000 years or so of human civilization in this region, there's a number of turnovers at various times. The Persian Empire is strong at various times. India, there's even around 300 before the Common Era, there's even a brief European incursion into the region in the form of Alexander, the king of Macedonia, and his Greek army. This was ephemeral, nothing much lasted from it. Nevertheless, it's an interesting interlude. Now, by around 700 of the Common Era, 700 AD, Islam comes into the region. For the next 1,000 years or so, Islamic states will dominate the region. Sometimes the dominating power will be Persia. Sometimes the dominating power will be India, the rulers in Delhi or Agra, and sometimes the dominating power will be from the Turkic areas to the north, from Samarkand, for instance. You may have heard of some of the names of the individuals who conquer the region. Timurlane or Timur the Lame, essentially a Turkish ruler who ruled this entire area at around 1400 of the Common Era. His descendant Babar, about 125 years later, will found the Mughal Empire in India. But the situation starts to change around the 18th century, because then we get the intrusion into the region of Europeans on a sustained basis. Europeans around the 18th century will start to maintain a regular presence on the Indian subcontinent. At first, a variety of Indians, but by the middle of the 18th century, Great Britain is clearly dominant, and the British seek to move their influence to the northwest. It's about this time that the Mughal power in India begins to decline, that the power of Persia to the west begins to decline, worn out from constant warfare with the Ottoman Empire a little bit further west. And about this time, the Central Asian Islamic states are beginning to come in contact with the expanding power of Russia. So, around 1750, with Persia to the west in decline, with India in the east to decline, and with the Turkic states centered around Samarkand to the north in decline, we see the emergence of an independent state, semi-independent maybe better, around Kabul. Possibly, we call this Afghan, it's maybe. This state waxes and wanes, expands and contracts according to the abilities of the ruler at the time. Never a major power. But in the 19th century, then, this region comes under more pressure, especially from the British who have consolidated their power in India after the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, and the Russians, who march into Tashkent in 1865. And now, with the pressure from the north and the pressure from the southeast, sort of the way coal or diamonds are formed, a state coalesces here around Kabul. And Afghanistan. Both Britain and Russia indicate a lot of interest in continuing their expansions and come into a kind of conflict in this region. This conflict is often referred to as the Great Game. Who's going to get this area? The fact that there are almost no economic resources there really was irrelevant. This great game was played out through the last half of the 19th century. I always think of it in terms of the Rudyard Kipling's novel Kim, who becomes this Irish orphan boy. Kim O'Hara becomes an agent for British interests in this region. I'm not quite sure that's credible, but nonetheless, the story is nice. Only by 1907 was the Great Game resolved. And Russia and Britain make an arrangement that Afghanistan here will be a kind of neutral zone. Neither will dominate. Both will respect each other's interests there. And both will prop up the local ruler around Kabul. And they both, this is where, 1907, where the borders of Afghanistan more or less are determined. Not by the Afghanis themselves, whoever they are, but by the British and the Russians. This arrangement doesn't last long because within 7 years, Russia and Britain are fighting in Europe, and their interest in remote, unproductive Afghanistan is almost non-existent. Interestingly, the Germans will send a mission to Afghanistan to try to encourage the Afghanis to revolt, but the ruler in Kabul doesn't even know who the Germans are, so this wasn't very productive. Now, the British, after the war, are not interested in exercising influence in Afghanistan. They can barely hang on to India. And so, after 1919, they more or less withdraw from Afghanistan. And it remains a kind of backward, not very much developed state in the interwar period. But now, with Britain's problem in India, we get the origins of Pakistan, a much more recent political entity. During the 1930s, the independence movement in India becomes extremely strong, led, I'm sure, as you all know, by the spiritual guidance of Mahatma Gandhi. But a considerable part of the Indian population, not the majority by any means, but a portion, is reluctant to follow this kind of sensibility, Gandhi's sensibility. These are the Muslims of India. Increasingly, the Muslims of India, who had been there again since the 8th century, the Muslims were concerned that their identity would be lost if they were subsumed into the Hindu majority upon independence. And under the leader of their chief political figure, a man named Muhammad Ali Jinnah, they founded their own political party, the Muslim League, and demanded an independent Muslim state. In 1936, I think, they made up a name for this state, Pakistan. This Pakistan, P is for Punjab, a northwestern ethnic group. A is for Afghan, the Afghans, and K is for the Kashmir, the northernmost area of India. Stan is an old Persian word for country. So this is what they start to say they want. And when the British finally agreed to leave India in 1947, Jinnah and the Muslim League are successful in establishing a Pakistan in the west and also in the east at tremendous cost. About 1 million people will die as Hindus and others evacuate the areas designated for Pakistan, and as Muslims rush to move to these areas. Nevertheless, here by 1947, Pakistan and Afghanistan. Let me make one final point here, and it's an important one. There's no such thing as a Pakistani or an Afghani nationalist. Both these states are multi-ethnic. Identity comes not from the central government, but from the local authority. Whether one is a Pashto or Punjabi. In Pakistan, the main groups are Punjabis, Pashtos, Balukis, and Sindhis. Similar languages, not all the same. All Muslim, not all Sunni. In Afghanistan, again, Pashtos, Uzbeks, there are Persians in the west, and a bewildering complexity of other groups, including Mongols and Arabs. The identity, again, is not national. Both of these states, because of this, are very fragile. In both of these states, the central authority, whether it's in Islamabad in Pakistan or in Kabul in Afghanistan, has a great deal of difficulty in making itself accepted. In Afghanistan, for instance, the current leader is a Pashto. The Uzbeks are very reluctant to take orders from this guy. And this becomes even more problematic because there's an independent Uzbekistan directly to the north. Why not merge with those guys? So the continued existence of both these states becomes problematic. One final point. We're not dealing here with small numbers. Pakistan is the second largest Islamic state in the world, about 175 million people, who, by the way, have an atomic bomb. Afghanistan, much smaller, about 32 million people. Nonetheless, it's quite a considerable amount of humanity. Okay, that's the background. Now my two colleagues are going to tell you the real stuff.
Next speaker is, I want to recognize Dr. Adler is here, Dean, and Boris Peltzberger is here, also one of our deans. Brian Parkinson's been here since 2005. He got his bachelor's degree from Georgia Southern University and then got his MA, PhD from Florida State. He taught at Florida State. He taught in the London Center of Florida State. And he also taught in Tallahassee Community College before he came here. And I always say he took my position. Because I retired in 2005, and Brian took that position in history, and I'm glad he did because he's done a tremendous job. He teaches all types of third world history. He teaches Middle East, also teaches Africa. He's taught Asia, goes toward European history. He has a specialty in Egyptian nationalism. He's been a Fulbright Scholar to South Africa, and I say he's been a tremendous asset to the institution. He's going to talk about U.S. policy toward Pakistan. So please join me in welcoming once again Brian Parker.
Can I go over here? Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the relationship between the United States and Pakistan, recently or currently, they revolve around a few issues. One is nuclear arms, because Pakistan has nuclear arms, as Dr. Hall referred to. So does Pakistan's neighbor, whom they love, India. Not just being sarcastic there. And Pakistan has in the past distributed nuclear technology. All right. And so that is one of the main issues that revolves around the American and Pakistani foreign relations. Another one is tourism. That's my George Bush. Terrorism and tourists. The United States is working closely with Pakistan to deal with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and on the Afghan-Pakistan border. And so those are some of the more important issues. And then, of course, there's always American funding of Pakistan to keep them doing what we want them to do. So, and that relates to the third issue, which is cooperation. And most of this cooperation between the United States and Pakistan has to do with intelligence services. The United States CIA and the Pakistani ISI share intelligence, and they use that intelligence actually very recently to go after terrorists or militants, whether they be the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. So what has happened recently? Since the United States and Pakistan have been sharing more and more intelligence over the past year and a half, they have captured quite a few of what I would call Taliban shadow governors up in the northwest, like in Waziristan and the Swat Valley. They also captured the Afghan Taliban's chief military officer, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar. This man was captured in February. And since 2009, we have been launching drone strikes into Pakistan with the help of ISI and CIA intelligence. And these drone strikes have taken out many Taliban commander, including the terrorist who was suspected of the December bombing of an American army base in Afghanistan. So why has Pakistan been so interested in helping the United States with the Taliban and with Al-Qaeda? Well, because Pakistan has always been interested in rooting out internal extremists. And it took quite a few years, but suicide bombings and terrorist bombings inside of Pakistan have shown the Pakistanis that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are no longer foreign extremists, but people here domestically doing harm inside of Pakistan. So Pakistan has shown a strong willingness to get involved and go after these extremists who they think threaten their own internal security. Okay, the Pakistanis, they call the Taliban in Pakistan the Tariqi Taliban. That's like the Pakistani version of the Taliban, the Tariqi Taliban. It is an internal enemy of theirs. And so what has Pakistan done to respond to the Tariqi Taliban? They have spent a lot more money in terms of funding their troops. They're paying their troops more money so that they'll fight better for them, increase morale. They're providing better equipment for these troops that are fighting the Taliban, that are fighting Al-Qaeda, and they are increasing the number of troops. They have quadrupled the number of troops out in the northwestern tribal provinces in the past couple of years. So from 2009, 2010, they have quadrupled the number of troops they have on the ground. And they're paying these troops more. All right? They have increased the number of posts on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. That border is very rugged, very mountainous, and so it's quite easy for these militants to kind of slip through these posts. So they've increased the number of posts that they have by 8-fold, going from 100 to over 800 posts along this border, because it's quite easily to go back and forth. It's very fluid along that border, and they want to stop the Taliban and Al-Qaeda from moving back and forth along that border. And by establishing these new posts, they've carried out twice as many brigade-size they've carried out twice as many brigade-size operations in the past few years. And a brigade, by their numbers, is over 3,000 men. So operations involving over 3,000 men. All right, so they are trying to limit the ability of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to move across these borders. They're also trying to secure the border because NATO forces, American forces, and Pakistani forces often, their supply trains are often attacked along these borders by tourists or by thieves. And they have tried to limit the amount that they're losing to these guys. And they actually have done a really good job in doing so. But carrying out these operations has been costly for Pakistan. That's where the United States gets involved. We have been sending Pakistan billions and billions in aid. You know, we had been doing that previously, you know, to make sure we basically aid them to not fight India. But we've upped that aid, that dollar amount, so that they will help fight the Taliban and help fight Al-Qaeda. However, Pakistan, they think that, you know, the aid we give them is about half as much as they need to fully carry out these missions. All right? So they think that, yes, we're happy that the United States is giving them aid, but please send us more. Secondly, they're losing people. Pakistan loses more soldiers than the United States, or NATO for that matter, fighting this war. Every year they lose more soldiers. Okay? In last year, in 2009, NATO lost about 500 soldiers in Afghanistan. Pakistan lost over 800. So they're losing a lot more soldiers in this battle. And they're losing their civilians, because whenever they carry out operations in Pakistan, not only are they taking out the Tariqi Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but they're also taking out, sometimes indiscriminately, unfortunately, their own civilians. Okay? So thousands and thousands of Pakistanis have lost their lives in operations, but also in terrorist attacks, domestic terrorist attacks. Okay? And many Pakistanis, they feel like they are suffering because of American interests in the region. And so the goal for America is to continue cooperation between these two people when the Pakistanis feel like the brunt of, you know, the suffering is on their back. They're shouldering most of the effort, and the United States can kind of sit away and just funnel in money. That's part of the problem. So the United States, the Pakistanis, they want the United States to appreciate a greater appreciation of the sacrifices that the Pakistanis have made. And so I'll end with the statement that what Pakistan is doing is going to be a very long and slow process, because the Pakistanis don't really have the capability to put large numbers of soldiers into these provinces for a number of reasons. One of the interesting reasons is because the Pakistanis don't want to take many soldiers off their frontier with India. They're always worried India is about to attack. Okay? The Indians are coming, all right? Secondly, they also think that whatever is happening inside of Pakistan that's bad, like suicide bombings or terrorist attacks, or the Tariqi Taliban, they think that Indians are behind it. Okay? There's a conspiracy, and the Indians are behind it, all right? And so the country, the Pakistanis, they really just don't have the capacity to wipe out the Tariqi Taliban and Al-Qaeda in a very timely manner. So if we are going to take care of this problem, this situation in the northwestern frontier provinces, it's going to be a long haul. It's going to be slow because they don't have the ability to go very fast. They can only put in a little bit of guys at a time and take one small chunk of land at a time and then move from there once that's secured. Harry, on.
All right, our last speaker is Dr. Brian Smith. This is his second year here, political scientist. He, third? Okay, there you go. There you go, I missed it. Okay, well, 3 years just shows you how fast time goes. Got his BA from Oberlin College and his MA and PhD from Brown University in political science. And he worked at the Carter Center and has gotten a lot of fellowships, Woodrow Wilson fellowships and so forth. And he is going to talk on U.S. policy toward Afghanistan. So, Brian.
Good evening. I'm going to attempt to be reasonably parsimonious here, but I've been asked to speak on U.S. foreign policy towards a country we're currently engaged in an active war with. We've been in an active war to some extent with some different levels of troop commitments. We're going on 9 years now in Afghanistan. So when you say U.S. foreign policy towards Afghanistan, you're automatically wrapping it up with domestic issues inside of Afghanistan. Domestic Afghani politics plays a factor, and I'm going to try to minimize the amount that I actually delve into that and try to focus purely on the U.S. foreign policy towards Afghanistan, but it's going to naturally just have to spill over. I would characterize U.S. foreign policy towards Afghanistan as essentially involving itself in an ethnic civil war and nation building. That those are really the two main functions of our policy currently. We have an outstanding goal, a specific goal in mind to be engaged in these processes, but I'll be talking about that later. But just overall, I would have to say we're engaged in an ethnic civil war and nation building activities. To try to detail this, our policy implementation, I want to focus on 3 different things. I want to talk as briefly as possible about 3 different things. First, I want to place these 2 different activities, ethnic civil wars and nation building, in a context relevant to all of the third world. Both of these things are things that are problems that the rest of the entire third world are dealing with and have been dealing with for well over 100 years. And Afghanistan is just one example of that situation that we have, in fact, gotten deeply involved in this country. The second thing I want to do is I want to place current U.S. foreign policy in context to U.S. foreign policy towards Afghanistan over the course of the 20th century. Our current involvement is in some ways related to our past foreign policy towards Afghanistan. And finally, I want to talk about current U.S. foreign policy. Specifically, what are our exact goals as stated by both the previous administration and the current administration, and the actual strategies we're going to attempt to carry out that foreign policy. And so, obviously, those 3 topics could probably compose an entire book, and I could probably spend an entire course talking about that, so I will try to do that in 20 minutes. So here goes. The first of those things is the fact that ethnic civil wars and nation building are frequent, major political problems found throughout the Third World. Really, at least since the 19th century, definitely throughout the 20th century. When I keep on saying ethnic civil war, there are many different possible reasons and causes for civil wars to be tearing apart a country. You see ideological civil wars all the time, maybe struggles over one type of ideology versus another. The English Civil War, I don't want to just limit it to Third World, but any civil war between monarchists and people supporting democracy, whatever reason. There are many ideological reasons, economic reasons. Ethnic civil wars are one particular area of civil wars. And ethnic civil wars can be some of the most difficult to resolve. It's very difficult to come to some kind of negotiated conclusion to an ethnic civil war because loyalty tends to remain consistent. You don't suddenly just change who you are ethnically. You don't suddenly just become willing to forgive hundreds of years of ethnic conflict and strife and be able to settle that in some kind of, well, let's just split the resources way. In fact, historically, it's been very difficult to construct some kind of new overarching ethnic identity or national identity that can take the place of old conflicts. So in Ivory Coast, there might be 50 different ethnicities, and it can be very difficult for them to all just give those up and just become Ivory Coasters, become some kind of new identity. In fact, of the 46 or so, depending on how you count them, ethnic civil wars since World War II, exactly 0 have been solved in this fashion by creating some new national identity. For example, an Afghan identity, which obviously is what I'm going to come back to. In fact, the most common successful resolution to any ethnic civil wars has been simply separation. Some kind of, let's just go our separate ways, become different countries, or create some kind of extreme form of autonomy inside of a single country, allowing those two ethnic groups to separate themselves. That has its own problems. You tend to create various states that are not economically viable. That's a particular problem in the Third World, where if you have two competing ethnic groups who are fighting out, you can't just say, let's split up and go our separate ways and become separate nations, because that first country was devastatingly poor. And so it would be very difficult to just say, okay, let's take this devastatingly poor and just have an economy based on even a small portion of that poverty. And so it becomes economically unviable. Also, you have a tendency to turn domestic conflicts into international conflicts. If you look at India and Pakistan, for example, they used separation to solve their ethnic, as well sort of ethnic/religious conflict, but then that just turned that into an international conflict. They went from a civil war to an international war. And it also tends to promote instability in other countries. If you took the Kurdish region of northern Iraq and simply said, okay, let's allow them to become Kurdistan, like they would like to be. Well, suddenly the Kurds in southeastern Turkey, who have also been fighting for independence, suddenly have something to immediately attach themselves to, like Uzbekistan and the Uzbeks in Afghanistan. Well, so there are a lot of pitfalls for the only thing that has in any way been at all successful in solving ethnic civil wars. In the country known as Afghanistan, as Dr. Hall pointed out, there is very little in the way of any Afghani nationalism, let alone any unified identity of being an Afghan. You saw a little bit maybe slowly developing in the middle of the 18th century. Around the 1740s, they had a kingdom that was much larger than the present-day Afghanistan, but that never turned into sort of a modern European nation state where you have the French starting to think of themselves all as Frenchmen to some extent, at least. Identity in Afghanistan tends to be grounded in ethnicity, family, and clan, which extends very much into the politics and civil wars that the country has experienced for the past 30-plus years. Inside of the civil war going on currently, there are certainly some religious issues. You could call it, to some extent, a religious civil war, in the sense that the Taliban, which that we're at war with, have somewhat more extreme religious views in terms of the kind of Islamic law they want to see enforced. This is true. There are also some economic issues. There's certainly a great deal of civil wars going on in Afghanistan having to do with the fighting over control of rich agricultural areas of Afghanistan, potentially future controls of natural gas deposits, which are plentiful in Afghanistan. But for the most part, I feel, my personal opinion, and I think a lot of political scientists would agree, that it is ultimately an ethnic civil war. At the very heart of it is a civil war between the Pashtuns and everybody else. The Pashtuns being the dominant Afghan ethnicity, sort of located in southern and eastern Afghanistan, as was talked about, bordering up against the Pashtuns inside of Pakistan as well, naturally enough. And certainly during the 50s and 1950s and 1960s, when there was a great deal of civil and political turmoil inside of Afghanistan, there was actually an independence movement amongst the Pashtuns that was sort of feeding into these civil wars. They wanted an independent Pashtun state. They wanted to chop off part of Pakistan, chop off part of Afghanistan, and become Pashtunistan or something of the equivalent. During the 1990s, these tensions and conflicts inside of Afghanistan led to a civil war between essentially the Pashtun Taliban and a group of warlords who had been fighting amongst themselves, who were then, some of them were defeated by the Taliban, and then eventually only a few non-Pashtun warlords survived in sort of the northern corner of Afghanistan. These warlords who were non-Pashtun, there were Uzbek, there was Tajik, there were others, different ethnicities, were all fighting against the Pashtun Taliban, which received at least some support, not just because they were Pashtun from the rest of Afghanistan, but they were providing some kind of stability from the ongoing civil wars. And that was called the Northern Alliance, those remaining warlords that the United States eventually decided to side with after Al-Qaeda attacked us, and this Taliban government refused to do anything about handing over the Al-Qaeda members inside the country. So, in my opinion, it is therefore the current ongoing civil war is best classified as an ethnic civil war and is a very common problem seen all throughout the Third World. The other issue is nation building. Nation building has been an issue in foreign policy, not only for the United States, but for many other empires, and internally, domestically, an issue for many countries in the Third World, at least since the 19th century. Historically, it's generally nation building. The idea of nation building means developing a new national identity, creating some kind of concept that we are a unified nation within a certain geographic border that was set out somehow by the interstate system, but also expansion of state capacity to govern, the ability of the government to actually rule over their country geographically. After the Cold War, nation building tended, at least for the United States and a few other countries, as well as internally to many third world countries, nation building also meant expanding democracy, creating more and more powerful and strong democratic institutions. So nation building sort of encapsulates all three of those different factors, particularly democracy in more recent days. And really, when you look at the third world overall, and you're talking about the problem of nation building, there have been numerous struggles to actually accomplish this. Colonialism didn't help. The colonial empires conquering most of the world did not help with the eventual nation building problems, because a lot of the colonial empires tended to draw lines on a map that were for their benefit, not for in any kind of historically accurate or useful way. For example, Afghanistan and Pakistan, the border between the two that kind of cuts right through the heart of Pashtun lands, was created by the British Empire. It was just a line drawn on the map by somebody in India. But colonialism should not be, when you look at the third world, colonialism, you shouldn't overstate it was the only thing that caused these sorts of problems when it comes to nation building. The exact same problems we see throughout the third world in terms of establishing state capacity, creating new national identities, and all the problems politically, violent politics that comes out of those efforts. You saw those in Europe too, through the 17th century, through the 18th century, etc. They're simply experiencing it a little bit later, and it was possibly drawn out because of colonialism, and it was aggravated by it. But you can't just, this is true of any time you have any kind of nation building efforts, these things happen. Okay, therefore, Afghanistan is faced with this problem of nation building. It's very common throughout all of the third world. It is aggravated in Afghanistan because it lacks any national identity, and Afghanistan has never been a country with any kind of strong central government. Really, you have to go back to Genghis Khan and Tamerlane while their armies were actually in Afghanistan to actually find a strong central government that ruled over the entire country. Other than those brief few years and moments in time, Afghanistan has never, ever had a strong central government that ruled over the entire geographic area known as Afghanistan. So that's the first topic. I just wanted to sort of place this the two problems, the two things we're doing in Afghanistan, fighting an ethnic civil war and nation building in some kind of third world context. The second topic is the history of U.S. foreign policy towards Afghanistan. I want to kind of place current in context of the past. After World War II, our primary foreign policy concern in the United States was, and always shall be during the Cold War, containment. We were working to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union. Before 1978, that meant we had relatively minor interest in Afghanistan. Before 1978, there was a little bit of involvement in the United States and Afghanistan. We did a little bit of economic assistance, tiny little drips of economic aid for development. We paid American construction companies to go there and build roads. There are very few roads and highways in Afghanistan. What there are have been mostly blown up and are mined heavily, so are not very useful, but the ones they have, we built for them. We helped build this highway system there. You know, we paid American construction companies to go and do this there. The general idea was we were investing everywhere in the third world to some extent to have some kind of involved relationship with them and potentially assist in economic development and increase our trade with countries. However, that all changed in 1978. In 1978, the history of Afghanistan took a radically different path. In 1978, there was a Marxist coup d'etat. There had been expansions of the roles of political parties under a king. There had been a series of either outright coups or seizures of the government during the 60s and early 70s. This went back and forth. A couple different Marxist parties had grown in power, and eventually the military helped support a Marxist overthrow of the government in 1978. However, internal problems to that government, they started fighting amongst themselves. There were actually a couple different, with that family clan thing popping up inside of Marxist ideology that was tearing the government apart, and so it almost immediately started disintegrating. But the Soviet Union came riding to the rescue of this coup d'etat inside of Afghanistan, and this led to the Soviet Union's invasion of and occupation of Afghanistan throughout the entire 1980s. Whereupon, we were suddenly interested in Afghanistan in a big way. That whole containment policy suddenly applied to Afghanistan. And so we started investing heavily in fighting the Soviet Union's invasion, supporting various groups to resist, which was really easy to do, relatively speaking, because, well, no one had managed to really fully conquer Afghanistan outside of just like a few major cities in its entire history. And so the Soviet Union was having a lot of problems. Eventually it withdrew at the end of the Cold War in 1989, And from throughout the 1990s, there was very little U.S. foreign policy active in Afghanistan. We tried to promote a little bit of good governance, that sort of thing. But other than that, we allowed it to degenerate into a civil war. Not that we could have necessarily stopped it from doing so, even if we remained fully engaged. And eventually the Taliban took over, which is when we got interested again. Because in 2001, we had the September 11th attacks by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and Taliban, the Taliban were allies with one another. We forced Al-Qaeda to leave Sudan and they fled to Afghanistan. And so the United States entered the ongoing civil war on the side of the Northern Alliance, that non-Pashtun collection of warlords. And we allowed them to take power in Afghanistan again. The Northern Alliance warlords, they kind of redivided up the country. We didn't so much defeat the Taliban and Al-Qaeda there. More or less, they ran away in the month between September 11th. They actually started running before the attack. They kind of got warning from Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban started fleeing into the mountains. They started leaving the cities, even literally before the attack. But in any case, they were able to withdraw into their sort of mountain fastnesses. So from 2001 to the present, we have been continuing the fighting against the Taliban and doing various nation-building work after the Taliban were sort of forced back into the mountains. We also created a very, very weak central government, sort of very at the heart of our foreign policy, which I'll get to, the current foreign policy, which I'll get to in a second, is the creation of a brand new Afghani government. It is very weak, it is not very respected. Hamid Karzai was kind of like our guy. I don't like the fact that I'm necessarily speaking out over a television to the fact that here's this person that our country is trying to have relations with and pumping up, but I have to say that he wasn't exactly a very popular figure in Afghanistan. This was not some national figure who was going to lead this country into some kind of new era. This was a guy who had a lot of connections with Western oil companies. He had been educated in the West. He had sat out most of the Soviet invasion, so he was kind of considered like a wimp by amongst most Afghanis. He was, sort of an effeminate European, but ultimately we put him in charge. And the best thing about him, to all the warlords, was A, he was Pashtun, so he wouldn't be immediately resented by a great deal of the Pashtun population, not immediately anyway. And second, he was so ineffectually a non-powerful entity inside of Afghani politics that he would be easy to control and manipulate, and he was one that nobody had any problem with because no one respected. And so we put him in charge of the provisional government. He did a deal with all the warlords to support him in the first election for president. He won the first election for president. Quite frequently, warlords literally rounded up people and told them to vote for Karzai inside their areas. And over the next following 5 years, Afghanis tended to refer to him as the mayor of Kabul, because basically the United States and most NATO forces tended to be focused only on the capital, and that was about as far as his influence stretched. He simply sort of did a deal with all the warlords. I won't bother you. I'll continue to shuffle American aid to you, and you continue to politically support me. In 2009, he won re-election under an electoral process that everybody said was corrupt and fraud-ridden, and his government has been more and more unpopular just due to the vast amount of corruption present in it. Currently, we have about 80,000 troops in the country between us and NATO, plus a little few more troops as well. Many civilian workers are also actively engaged in nation-building work throughout the entire country, and we are trying to keep that government alive and functioning. So, I promise this will be brief. The final topic is, what is the actual strategy we're using? What is U.S. current foreign policy? It essentially remains the same under our current administration as it did under the last. We've tweaked it a little bit, but it essentially remains the same. winning this ethnic civil war against the Taliban, and nation building. Of course, our government puts it in far more politically correct terms. They don't like saying the words nation building because every time we try to do nation building, it doesn't seem to either work or it didn't matter if we tried. It sort of works itself out by itself, or it just fails utterly. We also don't like calling this an ethnic civil war. We like calling this fighting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. According to the Department of State and the Department of Defense, our foreign policy goal is to destroy and prevent the return of Al-Qaeda and its allies, by which they mean the Taliban. That's the goal. That's why we're there. The strategy to reach that foreign policy goal, though, is this huge, wide range of economic, technical, military, and political involvement that amounts to, if you wrap it all up, fighting an ethnic civil war and nation building. For example, we are engaging in economic stabilization and growth. And if you look at the GDP growth of Afghanistan, it's actually quite impressive. Dr. Samedra, I'm sure, has actually spoken on this in a previous Third World seminar talk. And various economic development is undergoing, various economic assistance is going. For instance, we just worked to relieve Afghanistan of all of its debt. We are literally forgiving all of its international debt. We just last week, I think we forgave 1.6 billion. Us and the Parents Club forgave 1.6 billion. They've got only like 11.6 billion total debt, and they're working to essentially wipe out nearly all of it to give it some kind of economic basis to continue to grow by getting rid of all of its foreign debt. We're also rebuilding the physical infrastructure. There are also rule of law programs where we're trying to expand the police force, the Afghani police force, which unfortunately is rife with corruption, but nevertheless we are expanding the Afghan police force to try to actually have some methods of creating stability outside of having militias and local warlord armies, as well as the Taliban. Various areas in which the Taliban have taken control inside of Afghanistan. One thing about it is, well, there's less crime in those areas, unless you consider the Taliban rule itself a crime, which many do. All sorts of anti-corruption efforts are ongoing as well under this rule of law program because the government is considered so incredibly corrupt. One fun area we're doing is attempting to create agricultural jobs. A central part of our strategy is to create agricultural jobs in Afghanistan. One thing we want is to get people to give up fighting and go back to work farming as a source of income. We also want to reduce the Taliban's funding. Afghanistan produces 90% of the world's opium, which is the main, that's where heroin comes from. 90% now. And that money goes to pay for the warlords' armies. It goes to enrich anyone with any kind of political power. And it's a major source of funding for the Taliban. Basically, anybody who wants to buy guns that are not actively being given them by the United States buys them by selling heroin. It is in fact it's been estimated that roughly half of the GDP of Afghanistan currently is through opium production. But more importantly for sort of our efforts in terms of nation building is the fact that that's really the only source of good money for a lot of farmers currently living in Afghanistan. That's how they can feed their family, is by growing a little opium and then selling it, and it completely and totally dwarfs all of the rest of their agricultural production. We're literally only, the State Department is proud to say that only 2% of the agricultural land in Afghanistan is currently producing the opium. But again, that means 2% is all it's taking to supply 90% of the world's opium. And if they're trying to increase agricultural jobs, literally we have soldiers and civilian workers out there creating irrigation projects, bringing in modern farming equipment, pesticides, reworking the land to try to get rid of mines inside of cropland, trying to rebuild the infrastructure to carry crops to market. This massive agricultural project Well, that's nice, and it will possibly increase regular agriculture and is doing good things for the country. It's certainly money, that's going towards a good end. But at the same time, if you only need 2% of all the land, and that's where all your money is coming from, you can have both at the same time, and it's not going to replace the opium production. We're also looking to train and equip a stronger Afghan military, which nobody really respects outside of Kabul. There have been dramatic military efforts to seize Taliban stronghold villages, which nobody in Afghanistan has ever heard of, or really doesn't matter in terms of the national politics. A few major new components that have been added since President Obama took power, was elected, I guess is the better way of putting it. One is called reintegration. Reintegration, which means they are attempting to bring the Taliban back into the government. Kind of like inviting the Shiites more and more into, the Sunnis back into the Shiite government in Iraq, or many other such efforts all around the third world, where you have an ethnic civil war and you're trying to get the losing side to sort of come, stop fighting, get in the process, bring them in. It's called reintegration. They're trying to advance the rights of Afghan women. Secretary Clinton just added that to our strategy. Where the Islamic law has been in place. Afghanistan is currently an Islamic republic officially, and they use Islamic law for a great deal of their laws, and this has had a deleterious effect on Afghani women. And so another one of our strategies is now suddenly advancing the rights of Afghan women. We've also been trying to go around the central government. We've been trying to directly approach local governments. With aid and military presence. And in other words, we're not trying to rely on that corrupt central government quite as much that nobody respects, and try to make direct contact more and more on a village and tribal level. Well, I'd like it to close by bringing this full circle back to those two basic functions, the two basic problems we're involved with in Afghanistan, ethnic civil war and nation building. Because all of those interesting strategies that are doing good in the country, that are fighting the Taliban in an active way, occasionally maybe killing an Al-Qaeda fighter here and there, maybe building a good irrigation system for a country that had it destroyed 30 years ago. Those are all good things, but they have no real chance of ending an ethnic civil war. If this is, in fact, at its heart, an ethnic civil war, with maybe Islamic slightly more extreme Islamic overtones, certainly, maybe some economic issues involved, but ultimately an ethnic civil war, none of these efforts will in any way solve them. And so that ethnic civil war could essentially go on interminably, forever. The nation building efforts also run into basic problems. If our goal is to create, as sort of overarchingly expressed by our State Department, if our goal is to create a government that is stable and has the ability to exercise rule of law over the entirety of Afghanistan, that way the Taliban or Al-Qaeda can no longer take up residence in the country, then what you're talking about is creating something that has never existed in thousands of years in Afghanistan. And you're praying possibly for, well, we're more modern, we have satellites, we have rapid deployment troops that can move rapidly from one place to another, but it's still a country twice the size of Vietnam. Heavily mountainous as opposed to jungle. And really, every single time that any kind of ethnic civil war or nation-building efforts has managed to create a stable government through direct occupation, with foreign policy that involves direct occupation of a third world country like Afghanistan, or for that matter, a second world or first world country. Every time you have attempted to do those things, end the civil war, nation build, by direct occupation, where you force the competing ethnic sides to come in and share government power, kind of like you've got right now in Iraq, for example. If we managed to do that through reintegration in Afghanistan, every time in history, as soon as that occupying force left, it all fell apart again, immediately. And they ended up essentially solving their own problems, eventually, their own ways, again, whatever that happened to turn out. Sometimes it was actually a good result. Sometimes it was a bad result. But nevertheless, it happened every time. So we're doing a lot of good. U.S. foreign policy is doing a lot of good over there, I would say. But in terms of actually achieving the end goals being expressed as the goals of our foreign policy, it would have to solve these nation-building problems and these ethnic civil war problems, and history just doesn't look favorably on that. Thank you.
There's got to be some questions and all information.
So we'll be there forever. We'll stay in Afghanistan like North Korea, South Korea. We'll be there.
It could take that if we want to try to enforce some kind of stability over the central government, certainly.
Yes.
I've got one. I don't know if Dr. Parkinson maybe. With the lack of stability of the Pakistani government, where do the nuclear weapons come from? And I was watching a special on, I guess it was NBC the other day, talking about the lack of stability of the government. How safe are those particular?
There's a guy named A.Q. Khan, who was the head of their nuclear development organization there. And then once that was up and going, A.Q. Khan basically took his knowledge of building an atomic weapon, a nuclear weapon, out on the market. And so he's shopped it around. So A.Q. Khan's the guy.
Well, I'm sorry. Why do we we're so adamant about other nuclear weapons around the world and preventing them? Why have we not heard more about that?
I think that was an interesting period in the history of there. Traditionally, the United States had been more pro-Pakistani than pro-Indian because India had a somewhat socialist or socialistic or more left-leaning government. So during the Cold War, we were more pro-Pakistani, but eventually India went towards a democracy, and then we shifted, in favor of India, but we never left our allegiance with Pakistan, and so we were kind of caught in a situation where we were having to support both sides, and we couldn't pick and choose. Okay, you can have nukes and you can't, or I don't think we really had the ability to do that.
Plus, they never signed a non-proliferation treaty.
Yeah, neither signed a non-proliferation.
Neither India or Pakistan.
Any other questions? Yes, Gary?
Well, given the rather bleak prospects you've outlined for achieving what we want to do in Afghanistan, Dr. Smith, what do you think is continuing to drive U.S. foreign policy?
There was at one point in time in 2001 a legitimate concern of eliminating Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, but it's unclear exactly what the original point of that was, because although there were training camps in Afghanistan that we wanted to see eliminated by our military presence there, all of the terrorist activities that would actually threaten the United States in any way, shape, or form can take place in a basement in Berlin. All these, while it's true, a lot of the vast majority of Al-Qaeda's training that went on in Afghanistan did actually need sort of open spaces to some extent, because about 90% of all Al-Qaeda's training efforts in Afghanistan had to do with simple, like, weapons usage, learning how to fire automatic weapons, grenades, that sort of thing. But we're not really concerned about an army of Al-Qaeda invading Florida, and we can handle it if they try, and would like them to, really. But the other 10% of training, they could do anywhere. They didn't need a nation state to support them. The original foreign policy goal of the Bush administration that got us into the first 7 years of the Afghani war, as well as the Iraq war, as far as terrorism and Al-Qaeda went, was the idea, what they called the draining of the swamp strategy. Basically, these countries were swamps in which terrorists could sneak about and grow and develop, and it would cause new terrorists to grow. And we need to drain that swamp and turn them into nice, happy, fertile democracies that would not want to, do things like blow us up. And so the original goal was very state-centered, where we'll construct governments that are friendly to us, that will eventually economically and democratically prosper, and in those conditions, the threat of terrorism, which was sort of the motivating goal of at least the Afghanistan war overall, that goal would be achieved. The trouble is, and possibly why President Obama is saying that we were going to start withdrawing troops by 2011, is that we would essentially permanently have to have a presence there, and it doesn't actually achieve the strategy goal, the overarching goal of defeating Al-Qaeda to any extent. So what are we doing there? We're continuing to do what we've been doing, essentially, for a number of years, which has been reasonably ineffectual at achieving what we're trying to do. I'd say the only thing that's in any way productive has been the involvement of Pakistan, essentially no longer treating Pakistan as like this unviolent border, and we've been more heavily militarily involved in tracking down Taliban and Al-Qaeda supporting Pakistan. But then, if we manage to chase every single member of Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan and Pakistan, they'll just go somewhere else.
Well, look, it's been a great academic exercise. And so if you have no other questions, we'll just adjourn for the evening. Thank you very much for your attention.
No practical.
Huh?
An academic.
Well, no.
Thank you, sir.